my colleagues. Again, 5 minutes, questions and answers. So if the questions can be short and the answers short, you get more in. So, Senator Seidman.
Thanks, Chair. And thank you all very much for sharing your stories with us. Clearly personal, but as well as your expertise, and it's been helpful. Thank you. Perhaps Ms. Black, if I might ask you, because you did say that you are representing the BC Compassion Club Society, but then in full disclosure told us that you're also working for Canopy Growth. Yeah, so I thought that was particularly interesting. And so I'd just like to know, when did you accept a position with Canopy Growth?
I have been working with Canopy Growth for over 3 years. My position there is the Director of Patient Education and Advocacy, and at the same time I continue as the founder/mother of the Compassion Club, and I will always have a commitment to ensuring the continued care of the clients that I'm responsible to at the Compassion Club.
Great. It's interesting. Is it becoming then more common for patient advocates to take paid positions with cannabis producers?
I would say that many of the licensed producers are looking for people who have experience in educating and working with patients. When I was just listening to the pharmacist speak about the importance of having a pharmacist or healthcare professional be the person dispensing cannabis, I would suggest that there is a very important role for a healthcare professional, but more importantly, what patients need is access to somebody who has an expertise in cannabis themselves. So people who have been distributing cannabis in civil disobedience, breaking these unjust laws until the country decided to start transforming them. There are employment roles for us, either with licensed producers or with specialized cannabis clinics. And in fact, there aren't enough of us, and that much of the experience and education that I have, I'm working on transforming that into education platforms through Canopy Growth, so that knowledge will be available on a much more broad scale. Okay. Even to the pharmacists, who I may suggest probably have a tremendous amount of learning to do about cannabis.
Okay, thank you. If I might, my time is short. I don't mean to cut you off or interrupt, but I did want to get to this excise tax issue because it's clearly an important one. And we're pre-studying C-24, portions of it, in the Senate. And the amendment was not passed in the House of Commons, which would have exempted medical cannabis from the excise tax. And so what advice would you have for us here in the Senate now that we deal with the provision in the bill when it arrives?
My suggestion would be that I believe that the people in Health Canada and the people in the Canada Revenue Agency are very intelligent and will find a way to make a system work where patients can either get a refund in their taxes for the taxes that they pay, or there is a system where they are exempt from paying them in the first place. And I would suggest to you that from a moral and an ethical and a compassionate place, that this is one of the most important things that you can address. The tax on patients, the sales tax in itself is unethical and unacceptable. Okay. And I would say, like, borderline, like it doesn't comply with the essence of our tax laws.
I don't mean to interrupt, but I'd like to have somebody else's viewpoint on that. Perhaps Mr. O'Hara, if you could please.
Let me just add one important thing, and that is that understand the term medical cannabis. I just heard in the Finance Committee the other day MP O'Connell state that medical cannabis was already exempt from excise tax, and that therefore the amendment that the NDP had tabled was redundant. What's important to note is they're playing kind of fast and loose with the term medical cannabis. What a number of conversations I've had and a number of MPs have had, they're talking about medical cannabis in the context of Sativex, which is a prescribed medical cannabis derivative, but it's not medical cannabis per se. So I would urge everybody to understand that and not get confused if that comes up. And in essence, be prepared for those conversations that will definitely take place.
And so how should we deal with this provision in the bill?
Well, it's very, very, very simple. Medical cannabis, as authorized today, should be fully exempt from all taxes, especially excise tax. And what we need to recognize is that excise tax essentially is a compound tax. It's tax upon tax.
Yeah.
It's inherently evil, and that just shouldn't exist.
Okay, thank you very much. Senator Dean.
Thank you. Mr. Tousaw, I'm picking up on your point about social sharing and the impact of, in terms of closeness of age, an individual sharing with a peer or relative. What would be your advice if we were to try to tackle that? What would be a straightforward means of just opening the door a little bit to some limited social sharing?
Let's be clear, I think C-45 takes some steps in the right direction by not criminalizing young Canadians for possession of under 5 grams of cannabis. But you're precisely right to say this close in age issue is a very serious issue. I mean, my daughter, my eldest daughter, is 17. Her peer group includes people down to 14 years of age and up to 18, 19, 20 years of age. And it is perfectly normal behavior for young Canadians that are 19 to potentially use cannabis and share cannabis with their peers that might be under the legal age, under C-45. We have a close-in age exemption to sexual conduct laws, for example, in the criminal code. And that type of close-in age provision, if you're within 2 or 3 years of the person you're engaged in the activity with, could easily be imported into this. But I think that doesn't necessarily go far enough, because one of the things this bill also does is it criminalizes a parent who would want to have their teenager, for example, use cannabis in the home as opposed to out with their friends or out at a party or something like that. I mean, with alcohol right now, you can allow your children to use alcohol in your home without fear of criminal penalty. And that makes sense. That's how you teach young people appropriate behavior. This sort of forbidden fruit idea actually drives people towards unsafe use of substances. We see it with alcohol, we see it with other substances. And so I think it's important to recognize that parents need to have an active and participatory role in their young person's development, in their children's development. I would much rather that my children are introduced to cannabis on my back deck by me than by a shopkeeper or by a peer driving around or at a party with other 16, 17, 18-year-olds. And we know they're doing it. Look, let's not pretend here. We have some of the highest youth rates of cannabis use in the Western world. That's not... And our kids are pretty good. They're doing pretty well. We have really good outcomes in this country for a lot of children. It's obviously socioeconomic dependent, as all things are. But we need to be sensitive to these kinds of issues, and we need to not be looking at people and saying, well, you could go to prison for 14 years if you pass a joint to someone in your peer group. That seems to me to be completely wrong-headed.
Thank you. Do I have time for one quick question?
Yes.
For Ms. Black? You mentioned concerns about placing potency limits and restrictions on high-potency cannabis products. At the outset of legalization in Canada, we would see only 2 limited products, dried cannabis and oil, both at the low end of the potency spectrum, I think it's fair to say. There have been some suggestions in discussions here that even those low-potency, limited initial product offerings should have potency limits imposed on them, possibly on an age basis. What's your reaction to that?
Well, the people will just consume more of the plant matter to achieve the desired effect. So you may end up inhaling 2 grams of cannabis in one sitting to try to obtain the desired effect, which is not in the interest of public health. When people are using potent flower or extracts that have been made, they're able to inhale or ingest a much smaller amount of the plant material to reach the desired effect. So in that way, potency limits are not going to achieve those goals of limiting the amount of THC or CBD that people are taking in. And then on the other side is that you will just be forcing people to continue to access the products that they want in an unregulated market. So the goal really is to bring all of the products in all of its forms and all ranges of potency out of the unregulated market and into the regulated market. When we're distributing cannabis in a regulated way, we have the opportunity to provide proper education. So at my Compassion Club, every patient gets an hour-and-a-half intake session, which I'm not saying is necessarily replicable in a retail environment, but that kind of knowledge that we have about how to teach people, either patients or recreational consumers, the safe place to start and how to slowly increase their dose until they reach the desired effect without any adverse effects. We can provide that kind of education in a regulated environment, and that's your best tool for avoiding the adverse effects that I believe you're trying to avoid through potential potency limits.
Thank you. I think you've given us good advice.
Could I just add?
Okay. Very quickly, please.
Yeah. We hear from patients constantly, especially patients who are suffering from MS spasticity or chemotherapy-induced nausea. They need high THC. And the second aspect of that is the cost part of it. Even though it may be lower, then they're just going to consume more and more and more. So we're completely against that. We don't support THC limits.
Okay, thank you. Senator Poirier.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you all for the presentation. Greatly appreciated. My first question is for Mr. Tousaw, if I'm saying that right. Okay. We heard a lot in committee talk a lot about the education on the risk associated with cannabis, but not so much on not nearly enough education on the consequence of the law.
Mm-hmm.
And when it comes to possession or home growth or age limit, in your opinion, are Canadians young and old well-informed, aware enough today of the consequences of C-45? And if they're not fully aware of the consequences of C-45, what could be the impact, in your opinion, on the juridical system?
I think that's a very insightful question, and I'd even broaden it further. Not only are Canadians not well aware of the impact of C-45, Canadians aren't very well aware of the current laws surrounding cannabis. I cannot tell you how many people I talk to that think cannabis is legal right now. It's absolutely stunning. I talk to people that are in the regulated industry that don't know how the rule set works. The lack of knowledge, and look, it's complicated, right? I mean, you read legislation, you folks have all done it. It's not easy to do. You have to slog through it. It's referential. You have to think about it in a deep way. But there's a tremendous amount of confusion out there. And the problem with that is the legislation has so many sort of arbitrary limits that the people are going to just, of necessity, run afoul of it. For example, you're going to be allowed to possess 30 grams of cannabis, dried cannabis, and then there's this equivalency ratio that then applies to other cannabis products. So you're going to sort of have to do this math in your head when you leave your house. Well, I can bring 2 cookies with me, but not 4, because 4 means I'm breaking the law and 2 doesn't. Or I have this jar of cannabis here, and what? So I have to weigh it before I leave the house? It doesn't make a lot of sense, and it's completely arbitrary. When you go to the alcohol store, I mean, you can go into the alcohol store and buy enough alcohol to kill a small town and put it in the trunk of your car and drive away. Mm-hmm. And what we depend upon is Canadians exercising individual responsibility. We don't depend on the government to say, well, you can only buy 6 beer at a time each day, or you can buy 6 beer now, and then you can go home and drop it off. You come back to the store and you can buy another 6 beer and go home and drop it off. But that's the system that we're going to have for cannabis, and it doesn't make a lot of sense. And that's why one of my recommendations to this committee is that all criminal penalties associated with personal, not commercial, with personal possession and production of cannabis should be eliminated from C-45. Canadians deserve to stop being criminalized for their personal, individual choices. They deserve that from this committee and this government. That's the point of legalization. There also has to be education. Obviously, the government, I think Health Canada is doing a very good job so far of educating people at each step along the way what the changes look like and what the ramifications might be. But the best thing we can do for Canadians is just make it simple. You're allowed to possess cannabis. You're not allowed to unlawfully sell it. You're allowed to possess it. You're allowed to grow cannabis. You're not allowed to grow it, just like you can't make beer and sell it out your garage. You're not allowed to grow it and sell it out your garage. But you shouldn't risk going to jail for 14 years because you have 5 cannabis plants in your garden instead of 4. That just doesn't make much sense at all.
Do I have more time?
Yep.
Okay, my next question is for Mr. O'Hara. I was wondering if you could do a comparison for us when it comes to access to medical marijuana for Canadians in needs. What will be the impact of C-45 on the access of the medical marijuana? Will access be prevented? And in your opinion, would it put medical patients in need of medical cannabis in harm's way of turning to a different, less effective medication?
So there's a very short answer to that, and that is that C-45 doesn't really affect medical cannabis patients directly. This is more about the recreational side. So the medical cannabis patients will still be able to access cannabis through the ACNPR system, which to this point remains unchanged, which is one of the points that we're advocating strongly, that continue on. But there's nothing in C-45 for medical per se.
Do I have time?
Quick.
Okay. Mr. O'Hara, again, I understand that your organization has been working to get insurance companies to cover the medical cannabis. Can you give us an update or an overview of the status of this project? How many companies provide some coverage today, and are you optimistic that others will be following suit?
It's a great question. There are only a handful of companies that are providing coverage today, and it's important to note that they're providing coverage that is optional for that policy to be taken up. So just because they're enabling coverage doesn't mean to say that it's widely adopted. But there are some companies who have done that today. Sun Life is one, and there's a few others. I fully expect that to continue on, and there's a lot of interest and there's a lot of discussion around the topic within the industry.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Can I just follow up on that? Are there any provinces that are putting it onto their drug formulary in terms of coverage?
Good question. Not that I've heard.
Oh, okay. Senator Manning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for our witnesses. And, just quickly, Mr. Tousaw, following up on your comment in regards to the, I guess, confusion that's out there, I believe there's as many people confused as thinking that we're talking about decriminalization here instead of legalization with people that I talk to. And whether we're talking medical use. I'm just wondering, the C.D. Howe Institute has recommended that the government consider pardoning people previously convicted for cannabis possession and dropping any outstanding charges to free up much-needed resources for cannabis legalization. The government has said that they don't intend to pursue pardons at this time. I understand you've previously expressed your disappointment with this decision. Is there any reason why the government couldn't go ahead with some form of amnesty with legalization?
Great question, Senator. No reason whatsoever. There are literally thousands of pending simple possession cases in the criminal courts of this country sitting here today. People have been arrested to the tune of about 25,000 for simple possession per year while the government of Canada is debating this legalization process and bringing it in. That is unjust. The Justice Minister can direct the Public Prosecution Service of Canada to discontinue all prosecutions for simple possession or any cannabis offenses at any time that the minister chose to do so, and I urge the minister to do that. We just had a Supreme Court of Canada decision in Jordan about excessive delay. We see an already overburdened court system creaking its way day by day into further decline. We don't have enough judges. Why are we spending scarce resources prosecuting people for simple possession of cannabis? We also know, by the way, that simple possession is enforced in a discriminatory manner against visible minorities and persons of lower socioeconomic status. This is an absolute unethical, immoral process. We should stop. We should have stopped a long time ago prosecuting simple possession. Senator Nolan's report came out in 2002. So I think it's an important step, but there's so much more we can do. And we can do it without legislative change. We can do it by policy.
Just yesterday, I believe there's people charged in my home province of Newfoundland, Labrador with possession of, and here we are debating this issue here.
Well, that's right.
But just as a quick follow-up, the government has spoken at length about how the Cannabis Act will crack down on organised crime. We've heard conflicting evidence on whether or not this will actually be effective. We've heard from many sides, many different stories. One of the ones that they keep using here over the past is what's happening in Colorado. Last night on the CBC National News, Briar Stewart did a report on what's happening in Colorado and the fact that the organised crime black market seems to be just gone out through the roof. There's so much of it down there. So I'm just wondering, maybe you could tell us, help us understand the different perspectives on the presence of organised crime in the illicit market. Who's currently supplying Canadians with illegal cannabis? Is this criminal gang activity on a large scale, as the government suggests? That's something that we need to be looking at here.
A huge misapprehension is that people involved in the illicit cannabis economy domestically in this country are connected to organized crime. The referenced earlier in the earlier panel, and I referenced in my comments, about 95% of the domestic cannabis industry is not what we normally think of as organized crime, criminal gangs, people that are engaged in the use of violence. Most people, and I've represented hundreds, if not over 1,000 people charged with cannabis offenses over the last 15 years. I can tell you that with very, very few exceptions, I would invite them home to and have invited many home to meet my family and sit at my kitchen table. They're good people. They're people that are otherwise law-abiding. I think using terms like crackdown is part of the problem. C-45 is not going to crack down on organized crime. The only way, and I think the entire experience of prohibition is evidence of this, the only way that you eliminate an underground economy in a product is that you make it lawful and that you make it easy for people to transition out of the very vibrant, very well-entrenched illegal economy that exists today, out of the shadows and into the light. And Health Canada, I think, has taken several steps in the right direction with the promulgation of microproducer rules, microprocessing rules, and its policy decision not to automatically bar people with prior involvement from participating in the illicit industry. The individual provinces have taken varying approaches to that. British Columbia, I think, has said very explicitly, we're not having an automatic bar. On the other hand, Alberta's gone in the other direction. And so Alberta, with an otherwise, I think, very robust private retail system, has said, look, if you have any experience selling cannabis, you can't participate. Well, that seems to me to be a miss. Prohibition, criminal law penalties, including mandatory minimum penalties brought in 2012 by the former government of this country, have not made any impact in supply, consumption, or demand for cannabis in this country. Right? They don't reduce it. And so we can't criminal law our way out of this issue. We have to use common sense economic strategies. The illicit economy will go away when the licit economy is easy to participate in, carries the same range of products that the illicit economy does, and sells them with good customer service at good or better prices. That's how you get rid of the illicit economy. The idea that we're going to do it with a criminal law approach, I think, has proven to be a spectacular failure.
Okay, I have to move on, sorry. Second round, sure. Senator McCallum.
Thank you for your presentations. This is for Mr. Tousaw. I was wanting to talk a bit more about the criminalization of the youth.
Yes.
And I agree with you with that, because marijuana is used by a lot of young people to, I'm from a reserve. It's to deal with the social issues that they have. And I don't know if you've read Gordon Cruz. He worked with a lot of juveniles that were in detention systems. And that he said, do not, and he interviewed former residents, and they said to him, don't criminalize the young, and to give them alternate programs. Can you speak a bit about that?
Well, I think that's very sensible. Let's just situate this. The use of cannabis by young people is part of growing up. It's normal,
It is.
standard behavior. Not for everyone, not for everyone, but for a substantial portion of our young people. They are going to use cannabis. They are going to use alcohol when underage. They're going to do these things. We can't stop that. So what can we do? Well, we cannot make the impacts of that use dramatically worse by also involving them with the criminal justice system. Involvement with the criminal justice system for simple possession of cannabis provides no benefit to the young person. In fact, it's all negative. You become fearful of police and resentful of police. You become entangled with the criminal justice system. You might have a lifelong criminal record. You might not be able to cross the border in the United States. Future employers might turn you down. There's a host of negative consequences that arise simply because we've chosen to label that normal behavior as criminal behavior. We need to take a different approach. Our young people are the most precious resources we have. I have 4 children between the ages of 7 and 17. You know what? I don't worry about the fact that they may try cannabis. What I worry about is the fact that they may try cannabis and then become arrested by a police officer and develop a lifelong aversion to going to the police when they're in need of them. And I was this 16-year-old. You know, I was arrested for simple possession of cannabis more than once. I developed a real antipathy to police officers. And it wasn't until I became a practicing lawyer and worked with them on a daily basis, in an adversarial capacity, granted, but on a daily basis, that initial sort of feeling went away. And I realized that these are, human beings like everyone else, trying to do a very difficult job. And in the area of substance use, they've been tasked with an impossible job. It's impossible. They should not be the frontline response to substance abuse. Parents, educators, and social workers should be the first line of response, not the criminal justice system.
Okay. Thank you.
This is for Ms. Black. I was very encouraged with your club. You had said that you developed a gold standard for education, and coming from First Nations where there's a lot of addictions, and I'm wondering if you could share a bit of that with us.
Certainly. Well, first of all, it's about spending the time that the Compassion Club has the capacity to spend an hour to an hour and a half to every new client that comes in on a one-on-one education session. So that's a choice about making the investment of spending the staff time to do that. And over the years, we developed systems for teaching people how to start using cannabis very safely and to avoid their adverse effects. So when you're inhaling cannabis, it's actually easier to avoid adverse effects because you feel the effects right away. So you have a little inhalation off your vaporizer, you wait a minute or two, you decide if you want to take a little bit more, you have another puff, and you can feel the effects. When we ingest cannabis, it takes much longer for the onset of the effects because it has to be digested through our GI tract before it gets into our bloodstream. So when people are eating cannabis products is when we have to give them a lot of education. And when people say they eat a piece of a cannabis edible product, and 2 hours later they don't feel any effects, and so they eat some more. We call that cumulative dosing, and that's where they might feel the effects of both of those doses at once. And this is what the kids call greening out, which is where you might get a bit pale, and you feel nauseous, and you might feel anxious, and you might even vomit if it's a serious case. So when we're dealing with elders and people or seniors or people with very sensitive systems, it's really important that we avoid that. So in the old days, we didn't have access to laboratories because we were breaking the law and there weren't laboratories that would work with us, so we didn't have precise measurements so we would tell people to, say if they had a cookie, to take one little bite. And then wait until the next day to try taking more. Wait for a whole 24 hours. So now in the modern cannabis world, we do have access to laboratories. So if I'm dealing with somebody who's brand new to using cannabis, I will tell them if they need THC, if they're looking for, say, pain control, that they take equal amounts THC and CBD to balance them together, and you start at 2.5 milligrams, which is a very small amount. And then I encourage people to wait 24 hours before they increase by 2.5 milligrams. And this system can pretty much guarantee that it's going to avoid adverse effects. And it's the same kind of knowledge that we can easily translate to the recreational market when it comes to using potent products, about how to use them in a very safe way where you start slow and you go very slow but in a precise, measured way. And people will learn what the amount is that they need for the desired effect while avoiding any of the adverse effects.
Okay, thank you.
One quick sentence.
Very quick.
That's not really any different from how we deal with other medicines, right? I mean, your doctor will prescribe you a painkiller and say, take one, and if it works, don't take two. And if it doesn't work, maybe the next day, try taking two, up to a maximum.
Okay,
We're familiar with this.
thank you. Senatrice Meiji.
My question is, first of all, for Ms. Black. Why do you say that the Compassion Club is going to be jeopardized with the legalization of marijuana? Because you provide a service to people at the end of the day. And so why do you feel threatened by C45?
Thank you for your question. So the way that we have created the medical stream currently is through the licensed producers and through distribution of cannabis through the website and the mail order system. So the Compassion Club is a community center. It's a storefront. It's still engaged in civil disobedience 20 years later. I mean, we try to be lawful and to obey, bylaws and to be as lawful as we possibly can. So in Bill C-45, there is no provision for a community center that takes care of patients. So we could pursue getting a recreational license from the province, but in that case, we would not be able to supply all of the edibles and extract products that our patients rely on. And so we're in a place where we're going to be forced to continue to break the law to ensure that the medication that our patients are depending on is not interrupted until the time that that law changes. So there is currently no licensing scheme under either the ACMPR or Bill C-45 that is going to allow us to legally continue to provide the, in some cases, life-saving health care that we're providing to our clients. And so when I ask what can you do to help protect this organization, really what I think you can do is make a recommendation in your report to the government to find a way to give special status and protection to this organization, and we will work with Health Canada and find a way to creatively find licensing so that we can do what we're doing in a legal environment. And you need to bring edible products and extracts into the regulated market so that we don't have to continue to risk criminalization to provide the medicines that our patients require.
Mais comment comprenez-vous que les dispensaires?
How do you understand that dispensaries that will no doubt multiply exponentially with the adoption of C45, they don't have the same problem because their operations will be legalized? Could you not go through the same path as they? Focusing more on services to patients, is that possible? I don't even know if it's possible.
It is possible. We could apply for a provincial license, in which case we would be agreeing to no longer distribute finished edible products or any of the inhaled or ingested extracts because they're not in the legal market. And also the way that British Columbia is proposing to do supply is that they're going to have a central warehouse where the licensed producers supply this central warehouse, and the dispensaries will be able to purchase from that warehouse. And I do not have faith that that system is going to be able to do appropriate quality control and maintain the quality of this perishable product. I just don't believe that we're going to be able to maintain the quality of medicine, and definitely not the selection of products that patients are requiring.
Merci.
Let me, do you have another question?
No.
Oh, okay. Let me just follow up on that. You've existed for 20 years. Obviously, that's with some agreement or tolerance from local authorities who must think you're doing a good job. So why should you now suddenly feel threatened? You don't necessarily have to go into the mold. You haven't been in the mold for 20 years, so why would you think
That-
And let me also ask you, how many other compassion-type clubs are there aside from yours? Is it widespread? Or?
You know what? There are other excellent medical cannabis dispensaries that focus on patients. But what makes the Compassion Club very special is that all of the profits go to funding our wellness center. So people are using cannabis therapies in conjunction with a counselor and a nutritionist and an herbalist and an acupuncturist. And these services are being provided to people who are usually living in dire poverty and are often minority and marginalized. So this is the way that we are catching people that are falling through the cracks of the healthcare system. So there is, to my knowledge, no other organization that operates in the same way that the Compassion Club does across the country. And as we are evolving our legislation around cannabis, we have offered our expertise to the Parliamentary Health Committee and to the Senate. And every time we have an opportunity to come and help this government to shape the progress around the evolution of cannabis laws, we do that. And we don't want to continue breaking the law. We want to be legal, we want to be licensed, but we will be forced to continue to break laws until such time as all of the products that patients are requiring are legally brought into the regulatory framework.
Okay. That completes round one. I have a question for Mr. Tousaw before I go to round two. What you're saying about removing criminal penalties for simple possession, I totally agree with that, particularly as it relates to our young people. But you and others have pointed out this whole question of social sharing, 19-year-old with 17-year-old, and all those combinations, or they, you can end up in the youth criminal court with more than 5 grams, and yet an adult can have 30 grams. We've got all those things about close in age, social sharing, etc. Now, one point of view is, and I know a lawyer would never consider this acceptable, but one point of view is that they would never actually be prosecuted. That those kind of prosecutions would not take place, even though technically they are a violation of the law. Technically, if you, in some cases, it could be a fine, but it could eventually lead either in the youth criminal court system or the adult criminal court system. It could lead to something more than that. So what do you say to that, oh, well, there's nothing to worry about here?
Well, I have a two-part answer to that. The first part is that it's a common misconception that simple possession cases are currently not prosecuted in this country, and yet 26,000 people a year end up prosecuted for these offenses.
A lot of them minorities.
Well, and that's the second part of my question. Is my child, white, privileged, with a lawyer for a father, going to get prosecuted? No. But you know what? That's not good enough, because we know that these laws are applied in disproportionate manners against marginalized people, against visible minorities, against people of different socioeconomic status. And so I don't think it's acceptable that some people, like my children, like Mr. Trudeau's brother, get to escape criminal prosecution because of what they look like or their connections, and while others who don't have those connections, who don't look that way, end up in the criminal justice system. That's what we see today. That's what we're going to see in the future. Disparate enforcement of these laws, and it is absolutely unacceptable in a free and democratic society.
Okay, round two. We've got 7 minutes. Senator Seidman.
Thank you, Chair. And actually, my question was asked, and I believe, Mr. O'Hara, you answered it because it was about the insurance companies. So, yeah, so I'm okay. Thank you.
So you gained some time.
Yeah. So all is well now. I just want to be clear, but that's okay.
All is well in terms of the answer.
Right.
Still a lot of work to do in that area.
Well, there's no question.
Senator Manning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Once again, thank our witnesses. I'm a big supporter of decriminalisation, not necessarily of legalisation. I wanted to follow up with questions I was asking you before, Mr. Tousaw, in regards to the possibility of different provinces having some different rules. As I watch in Colorado as an example of some of the concerns that are in that area is the fact that Colorado has legalization while the next state may not. Quebec, from what we hear, is not going to allow homegrown, where New Brunswick is. You mentioned about British Columbia versus the storefronts in Alberta.
Yes.
I'm just wondering from a legal point of view what your concerns would be in relation to the fact that we're going to have a national law of C-45, but we're going to have provinces that are going to have different jurisdictions that we do, but are we going to have concerns from province to province interrelated?
I think we are, and I always like to divide this issue into two different things, commercial versus consumer, right? The business plan, the commercial regulation, I have concerns about, but the Como case in the Supreme Court of Canada made clear that provinces are entitled to regulate differently than each other, and even to impose certain barriers on interprovincial trade. And I don't think we're going to see another challenge to that provision for a good long time. My difficulty is on the consumer side, on the individual side. Look, on the commercial side, I think I have preferences. I think private retail is better than public monopolies. I think it makes a lot more sense. I think we're going to end up there eventually. We're going there for alcohol. It just makes more sense. But on the individual side, it's absolutely inappropriate to legalize personal production of cannabis across this country, and the federal government in this country is the sole source of criminal law jurisdictionally. But Quebec's to step in and say, well, this behavior that's otherwise lawful in the rest of the country, we're going to punish you for. We're going to criminalize this conduct as a province. Not only is it wrong-headed, because it's going to lead to the continuation of the problems that prohibition causes, but I just think it's not fair. Why should someone 1 foot across a line be able to grow 4 plants perfectly legally, and the person on the other side of that line, and maybe even be neighbors, can't do that, and the police could come in and arrest them for it? That is absolutely inappropriate. It should not be tolerated, and quite frankly, I think ultimately the courts are going to resolve that portion of the issue. I don't think it's constitutional for a province to criminalize otherwise lawful behavior that's lawful across the rest of the country. And if I spoke French better, maybe I'd take a case like that. But unfortunately, I don't.
Yeah. No, thank you. That's fine.
All right. Okay. Senator McCallum, you have another question.
I wanted to ask you if you feel that the excise tax and the criminalization of youth, would you say that's discriminatory?
Well, I think it is, particularly the excise tax. I join with everyone you've heard today to say applying an excise tax to medical cannabis. And let's be clear, it's not currently applied to medical cannabis. So we are adding a tax to sick and suffering citizens' burdens. So we should not be doing that. But any of these policies, just because of the way our society is structured and the institutionalized racism that we have and the institutionalized socioeconomic discrimination that we have, any of these issues are magnified when applied to people of marginalized groups, visible minorities, and people of lower socioeconomic status. Taxes hurt those folks more than they hurt people with means. I can pay the extra $1 a gram, even for my medical cannabis. I can afford it. But a lot of people can't. And we should be concerned more about those people than about people like me that aren't going to have these kinds of difficulties. And the same is absolutely true of every other aspect of taking a criminal law approach to this issue.
Okay. Anybody else? No? All right. We're finished. So.
I got a lot more I could say.
Okay. Well, the Senate is meeting in another 15 minutes, so time to wrap up. So I want to thank the three panelists that we've had in this second panel. You've been most helpful to us, and I appreciate the answers you've given to our questions. And colleagues, before you leave, I would remind you that we are back again tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. We have 8 a.m. We have 4 hours of dialogue with various officials on the 4 reports that came from the other committees. I also want to remind you that Any amendments or observations to the bill? Because on Monday at 3 o'clock, I think it is, we start at 1 o'clock on Monday, but we have an hour and a half with Mr. Blair and officials from Health Canada. But then at 3 o'clock, after a half-hour break between that session and clause by clause, we go into clause by clause. So amendments and observations, remember the request is they must be in both languages, and to fit the format of the clause provisions of C-45, they must meet that provision. You can't just have a general wording. It's got to meet the provision that goes into the bill, and that's why we suggested you consult the law clerk with respect to that. Those are due by 4 p.m. Tomorrow, so that we can get them all sorted out and get them ready for Monday. And we'll be getting them on the weekend, so there won't be much of a weekend break, but we'll be ready to go on Monday. So please remember all of that. And so this meeting is now adjourned. We'll see you at 8 a.m. tomorrow morning.